Mira had promised herself she would not go too far into the forest, but the morning felt calm and inviting, and the trees looked friendlier than the stories people told. She was not an adventurer or a fearless explorer. She was a simple person who liked quiet places, fresh air, and the kind of silence that helped her think. The last few weeks had been loud in her life, full of small problems that kept stacking like boxes in a narrow room. So when she saw a green patch on the map with a walking trail marked in light yellow, she decided to take a break and visit it. She packed a small bag with water, a sandwich, a light jacket, and a notebook. She told herself it would be a short walk, just enough to clear her mind, and then she would return before noon. The first part of the trail was easy. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds made soft sounds above, and the wind moved gently through the branches like a slow song. Mira walked with steady steps, watching the ground for roots and stones, and every few minutes she stopped to breathe in the clean smell of trees and earth. She felt lighter than she had felt in days. Her phone showed a weak signal, but she did not care. She did not want messages or calls. She wanted a small pause from everything. She took out her notebook and wrote one line near the top of a blank page. "Today I will listen to the forest and listen to myself." Then she smiled at her own sentence, folded the notebook back into her bag, and continued. After some time the trail began to narrow. The signs that once looked clear started to feel less certain. The footprints in the dirt were fewer, and the plants on both sides grew thicker, brushing her sleeves. Mira did not panic, but she slowed down. She looked around for a marker or a painted sign on a tree. She found none. She told herself the trail was simply less used here, nothing more. Still, a small warning feeling rose in her chest, like a quiet bell. She turned back for a moment to check the path she came from, but the trees behind her looked very similar, as if the forest enjoyed repeating the same pattern. Mira held her phone and opened the map again. The dot that showed her location seemed to jump a little, then settle, then jump again. She frowned. She tried to refresh it, but the screen only showed a spinning circle, then stopped without changing. Mira exhaled slowly and reminded herself to stay calm. She was not trapped. It was daytime. She had supplies. She could simply walk back the same way. She took a careful step and started moving in the direction she believed was correct. For a few minutes it worked. The ground sloped slightly downward, and she recognized a stone that looked like a small chair. She felt relief. But soon the slope changed again, and the stone was gone, and the plants looked different, and the air felt cooler. It was as if she had walked into another part of the same world without noticing the line between them. Mira stopped and listened. She could still hear birds, but the sounds were farther away now. The wind was softer, and even her own breathing sounded loud. She checked her bag, counted her water bottle, and held the strap tight like it was an anchor. She decided to find an open spot where she could see more of the forest. If she could see the sun clearly, she might choose a steady direction and keep it. She walked toward a lighter patch between the trees, but the light patch moved as she moved, like a trick. Mira began to feel the first real worry of the day. Not fear, not panic, but the kind of worry that makes your mind run faster than your feet. She told herself not to rush. Rushing makes mistakes. She took slower steps, placing her foot carefully, looking around, and leaving small signs for herself, like a bent leaf here and a small rock there. It was not much, but it helped her feel in control. Then she noticed something strange. The forest did not feel completely wild here. The ground, though covered with leaves, had a faint shape, like an old path that had been forgotten. Mira leaned forward and followed it with her eyes. The shape curved to the left, between two tall trees with rough bark. She hesitated. Following an unknown path could lead her farther away, but staying still would not help either. Mira told herself that paths often lead to something, a stream, an open field, or even a road. She decided to follow it for a short distance, just to see where it went. She counted her steps in her head to calm herself, 1, 2, 3, like a small rhythm. The air grew colder, but also quieter, and the trees around her seemed older. Their branches were thicker, and their roots rose from the ground like long hands. The light above changed, not because the sun moved, but because the leaves formed a tighter roof. Mira walked slowly, and the old path became clearer. It was not a modern trail. It was uneven and narrow, with spots where grass and small plants tried to erase it. Still, it was there. Mira felt a curious feeling in her stomach, the feeling you get when you discover something you did not expect. Her worry did not disappear, but it shared space with curiosity now. She followed the path around a curve, and then she saw it. At first it looked like a shadow shaped like a small shed. But as she stepped closer, it became a real structure. It was a cabin, but not like the cabins people build today. Its shape was unusual. The sides were curved, like the body of a wagon, and the roof had a gentle arch, as if someone had built a home from the idea of travel. The wood was dark and aged, and the door was made of thick planks. Plants grew around it, but they did not fully cover it. It stood there like a secret kept in plain sight. Myra's first thought was that it was part of an old story, the kind older people mention when they talk about the forest with serious faces. Her second thought was that it might offer safety. Even if it was empty, it would protect her from the cold air and give her a place to rest. Mira approached carefully, listening for any sound. There was nothing, no voices, no movement, no sign of anyone nearby. The cabin felt still. Not dead still, but waiting still, like a room that holds its breath. She looked at the door. There was no lock that she could see, only an old metal handle. She did not touch it right away. She walked around the cabin, keeping her steps quiet, as if she did not want to disturb whatever memory lived there. On one side she saw a small window, dusty but not broken. She wiped a corner with her sleeve and tried to look inside. The glass showed only shadows, but she thought she saw a table shape and maybe a shelf. The cabin was not collapsed. It was standing strong, which felt odd for something that looked so old. Mira stepped back and studied the structure more closely. The wood had marks that looked like careful work, not rushed work. Someone had built this with patience. She noticed a small carved symbol near the doorframe. It was simple, like a flower or a star, worn down by time. Myra's mind tried to place it, but she could not. She looked up at the roof. Leaves had gathered along the edges, but the roof itself was still firm. It was not falling apart. That made her feel both safer and more curious. Mira checked her phone again. Still no signal. The battery was not low, but the map was useless. She looked at the sky through the trees. The light had shifted. It was not evening, but it was no longer early morning either. She knew she should make a decision. Either she should leave the cabin and keep searching for the main trail, or she should use this cabin as a short rest point and then decide. Mira sat on a flat rock near the door and took a few deep breaths. She drank a little water, not too much, and ate a small bite of her sandwich. While she ate, she stared at the door. A part of her felt that opening it would be wrong, like reading someone's private letter. But another part of her felt that the cabin had appeared for a reason. Not a magical reason, but a simple one. People built cabins for shelter. If it was here, it could help her. Mira stood up and placed her hand near the handle, then pulled it back again. She listened. Still nothing. She tried to imagine who lived here and why. A traveler, a worker, a family, someone who wanted to be far from busy towns. Myra's curiosity grew stronger than her hesitation. She told herself she would only open the door a little and look, nothing more. She placed her hand on the cold metal handle and felt a small shiver run through her fingers. The handle was colder than the air. She took one more breath, steady and slow, then pressed down. The door did not open right away. It resisted, as if it had not moved in a long time. Mira pushed gently, then a bit harder. The wood gave a long, low creak, like an old chair waking up. A thin line of darkness appeared, and a smell drifted out, a mix of dust, dry wood, and something faintly sweet, like old paper. Mira opened the door wider, and the dim inside air met the light outside. She stood at the entrance, not stepping in yet, just looking. The first thing she noticed was that the inside was not ruined. It was dusty, yes, but not destroyed. A table stood near the center. A lantern sat on it. A small bed was pressed against the curved wall. Shelves held jars and folded cloth. Everything looked like it had been placed with care, then left, then protected by time. Myra's heart beat faster. She did not understand how something could look so old and yet so intact. She took one careful step inside, and the floor creaked under her shoe. Dust rose in a gentle cloud and floated in the air like tiny stars. Myra turned her head slowly, taking in every corner. She felt the strange feeling again, the feeling of waiting, as if the cabin had been quiet for a long time and now it was listening to her. She reached for the lantern, but did not light it yet. Sunlight still slipped in through the window, enough to see. On the table, beside the lantern, lay a small wooden box. It was plain, with a soft shine, as if someone had polished it many times. Myra stared at it and felt a sudden thought that made her swallow hard. This cabin did not feel like a random, abandoned place. It felt like a message that had been sitting here for a very long time, waiting for the right person to find it. Myra stood inside the wagon cabin for several quiet moments, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light. The air felt cool and dry, carrying the calm scent of old wood and settled dust. She closed the door gently behind her, not because she feared anything outside, but because the cabin felt like a place that deserved care. Sunlight slipped through the small window and fell across the table, touching the wooden box as if pointing at it. Myra did not rush. She walked slowly, counting each step, listening to the soft sound of the floor beneath her shoes. The cabin responded with small creaks, not in protest, but like an old voice acknowledging her presence. She placed her bag near the wall and took a careful look around. The shelves held jars filled with dried leaves and seeds, each labeled with simple handwriting. The bed was neatly made, covered with a thick blanket that looked heavy but clean. Nothing here felt careless. It felt prepared, as if someone once believed they would return. Myra ran her fingers lightly across the table surface and felt fine dust gather on her skin. She wiped her hand on her jacket and sat on the edge of the chair. Her heart still beat fast, but her breathing slowed. She reminded herself that fear often grows from the unknown, and the only way to shrink it is to understand what stands before you. Her eyes returned to the wooden box. It was not locked, but the lid fit tightly, like it was meant to protect whatever was inside. Myra reached out, then paused. She listened again. The forest outside was quiet, but not silent. A bird called in the distance. The sound grounded her. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside the box were letters, neatly stacked and tied with a faded cloth ribbon. The paper looked thin and fragile, but the edges were straight, not torn. Myra picked up the bundle and felt its weight. It was heavier than she expected, not in size, but in meaning. She untied the ribbon slowly and lifted the first letter. The handwriting was neat and careful, with each line spaced evenly. At the top was a date, written in a style she had only seen in history books. Myra swallowed and began to read. The letter was written by a woman named Anna. The words were simple, but full of feeling. Anna wrote about the forest, about building the cabin with her own hands and help from someone she loved. She wrote about waiting for that person to return from a long journey. The letter did not explain where the person went, only that they promised to come back. Myra read the letter once, then again, absorbing each sentence. There was no anger in the words, no bitterness, only patience. She picked up the second letter. It was written months later. Anna described the change of seasons, the way snow covered the cabin roof, the way silence felt heavier in winter. She wrote about hope like it was a living thing, something that needed daily care. Myra felt her chest tighten. She looked around the cabin again and imagined Anna sitting at the table, writing by lantern light, listening to the forest. Myra read letter after letter, each one dated later than the last. Years passed through the pages. Anna grew older in her words, though her hope remained steady. She wrote about repairing the roof, planting small herbs near the cabin, and leaving the door unlocked. The letters never said that the waiting ended. They only said that it continued. Myra placed the letters back in the box and closed the lid, resting her palms on the wood. She felt a deep respect for the woman who lived here, for the strength it took to wait without losing kindness. The cabin now felt less like a shelter and more like a witness to a long human story. Mira stood and walked toward the shelves again. She noticed small personal items she had not seen before. A carved wooden spoon, worn smooth from use. A folded scarf, its color faded but still soft. A small mirror with a crack in one corner. Each object felt like a quiet sentence in a story that had not been fully told. Mira wondered what happened to Anna. Did she leave? Did she keep waiting until she could wait no longer? Or did something else decide the ending for her? Mira sat back down and pulled her notebook from her bag. She opened it to a blank page and wrote a few lines, not as notes, but as a promise to herself. She wrote that she would remember this place and this woman. She did not know why, but the thought felt important. The light outside shifted again. The sun was lower now, and the cabin grew darker. Mira realized she needed to think carefully. Night in the forest was not something she wanted to face unprepared. The cabin could protect her, but she did not know how cold it would get. She also did not know if the main trail was close or far. She stood by the window and tried to see the path outside, but the trees blocked her view. The forest looked different now, shadows stretching longer between the trunks. Mira made a decision. She would stay in the cabin for a short time, rest her legs, then try to find the trail again before it became too dark. She gathered her bag and stood near the door. Before leaving, she turned back to the table. The wooden box seemed to watch her, not in a threatening way, but in a hopeful one. Mira hesitated, then took the box and placed it carefully in her bag. She told herself she was not stealing. She was protecting it. Leaving it here, forgotten, felt wrong now that she knew its story. Mira promised silently that she would bring it back one day, once the cabin was safe and known again. She opened the door and stepped outside. The forest greeted her with cool air and soft light. She closed the door behind her, just as gently as before. The cabin stood quietly, unchanged, but Mira felt that something had shifted. She followed the faint path back, marking trees more clearly this time, using pieces of cloth from her sleeve to create signs. Her steps were careful, but her mind was full. She thought about waiting and time and the way places can hold memory. After what felt like a long walk, the forest began to open. She saw a clearer trail ahead and felt relief rush through her. Soon she recognized a sign she had passed earlier in the day. She had found her way back. Mira did not stop until she reached the main path. She sat on a log and let her body relax. The forest no longer felt confusing. It felt meaningful. Mira knew this was not the end of her connection to the Wagon cabin. It was only the beginning of a responsibility she did not fully understand yet. As she walked back toward the edge of the forest, the weight of the wooden box in her bag reminded her that some stories do not want to stay hidden. They wait patiently for someone to carry them forward. Mira did not sleep well that night. She was safe at home, yet her mind kept returning to the Wagon cabin hidden deep in the forest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the curved wooden walls, the quiet table, and the small box resting in her bag. Morning light finally entered her room, and she sat up slowly, feeling both tired and alert. The forest had followed her home, not in fear, but in memory. She washed her face, made a simple meal, and sat by the window with the wooden box placed carefully in front of her. She looked at it for a long time before opening it again. The letters felt different here, away from the forest, but their meaning felt stronger. Mira read them once more, this time slowly, paying attention to small details she had missed before. Anna mentioned dates, seasons, and short events that hinted at a wider world beyond the cabin. She wrote about a nearby river, a distant road, and travelers who passed through once in a while. Mira realized that the cabin was not as isolated as it first seemed. It was hidden, but not unreachable. This thought stayed with her as she closed the box and made a decision. She would return to the forest, not alone and not unprepared. She spent the next few days researching old maps and local records. She visited a small town library and asked careful questions. Some people looked surprised when she mentioned the forest area, while others grew quiet. One elderly man remembered stories told by his grandfather about a woman who lived alone in a wagon cabin. He said people respected her choice and left her in peace. Over time, fewer travelers passed through, and the forest slowly reclaimed the land. No one spoke of how her story ended. Mira listened without interrupting, taking notes in her notebook. Each detail felt like a missing piece moving closer to place. The more she learned, the more she felt that the letters were not meant to remain hidden in a box. They were meant to be understood. A week later, Mira returned to the forest with a clearer plan. She carried proper supplies, marked maps, and a calm sense of purpose. The trail felt different this time, familiar rather than confusing. She followed the faint path with confidence and reached the wagon cabin before midday. It stood exactly as she remembered, quiet and strong. She opened the door and stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of return, as if the cabin recognized her. Sunlight filled the room more brightly than before, revealing details she had missed. Small carvings along the wall, faint marks on the floor, and a shelf corner worn smooth by frequent use. Mira placed the wooden box back on the table and opened it. She read the letters aloud this time, letting Anna's words fill the space they were written in. The cabin felt warmer, not in temperature, but in presence. Mira imagined Anna listening, nodding, perhaps relieved that someone was finally hearing her voice. As Mira read, she noticed something new. One letter mentioned a hidden drawer beneath the bed. Mira paused and looked at the bed closely. She knelt and ran her hand along the wooden frame. Her fingers found a small carved mark, similar to the symbol near the door. She pressed gently, and a narrow drawer slid open. Inside lay a thin journal wrapped in cloth. Mira held it carefully, aware that this was something deeply personal. She opened the journal and found daily entries written in the same careful hand. These words were more private than the letters. Anna wrote about her fears, her doubts, and moments when waiting felt heavy. She also wrote about peace, about mornings filled with birdsong, and about believing that love did not weaken with time. Mira felt tears rise, but she did not let them fall. She felt honored to read these thoughts. The journal revealed that Anna knew, deep down, that the person she waited for might never return. Still, she chose to live with kindness and patience. She wrote that even if the waiting ended without reunion, it would still have meaning. Mira closed the journal and sat quietly for a long moment. The forest outside seemed to listen. Mira realized that Anna's story was not about loss alone. It was about choice. The choice to wait without bitterness, to live without closing the heart. Mira felt a responsibility growing stronger inside her. She decided that the cabin and its story deserved care and protection. She documented the cabin carefully, taking notes and sketches rather than photos, wanting to remain respectful. She cleaned gently, moving dust without changing the placement of objects. She repaired a loose shelf with simple tools she had brought. Each small action felt like a conversation across time. As the sun lowered, Mira sat at the table and wrote a letter of her own. She did not address it to anyone specific. She wrote about finding the cabin, about listening to the past, and about promising to keep the story alive. She placed the letter back in the wooden box, tying it with the same faded ribbon. When Mira left the cabin that evening, she did not feel sadness. She felt completion, not an ending, but a continuation. Over the next months, Mira worked quietly with local historians and forest caretakers. She shared Anna's story carefully, without turning it into something careless or dramatic. The cabin was restored, not modernized, but preserved. People were guided respectfully, allowed to learn, not to disturb. The wagon cabin became a place of reflection, not attraction. Mira often returned alone, sitting by the table, reading a letter, or simply listening to the forest. She felt that Anna's waiting had finally reached its answer, not in the return of a person, but in remembrance. Mira understood now that some stories do not ask for rescue. They ask for witness. And by listening, she had become part of a quiet promise that stretched across more than a century, held together by patience, care, and the simple act of remembering. Time moved gently around the wagon cabin, and Mira moved with it. Weeks turned into months, and the forest changed its colors while the cabin stayed steady, like a calm thought that did not fade. Mira visited often, sometimes alone and sometimes with people who understood the value of quiet places. She never rushed these visits. She believed that the cabin deserved patience, just like the woman who once lived there. Each visit revealed something new, not because the cabin changed, but because Mira learned how to see better. She noticed how the light entered the window at different hours, how the wind made soft sounds against the curved walls, and how the forest seemed to breathe around the structure. The cabin felt less like an object and more like a presence. Mira felt it when she stepped inside, a sense of being welcomed without words. She continued to read Anna's letters, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. Each reading brought new understanding. The words carried strength, not weakness. Anna never wrote as someone waiting to be saved. She wrote as someone who chose her own way of living. This idea stayed with Mira deeply. It changed how she looked at her own life, her own waiting, and her own choices. Mira began to share Anna's story more openly, but always with care. She spoke at small gatherings, community spaces, and local schools. She did not use dramatic language. She told the story as it was, simple and honest. People listened closely. Many said they felt calm hearing it. Some said it reminded them of someone they once knew. Others said it made them think about time differently. Mira noticed that the story touched people quietly, without needing strong emotion or loud reactions. It worked slowly, like the forest itself. The wagon cabin became a place people visited not to take something, but to leave something behind. Some left notes of gratitude. Others left small handmade items. Mira allowed this only after careful thought. She placed a small wooden shelf near the entrance where visitors could leave a single object or note, nothing more. The rest of the cabin remained unchanged. Anna's belongings stayed where they had always been. Mira believed that preservation did not mean freezing time, but honoring it. One afternoon, as Mira sat by the table, she felt a sense of calm stronger than before. She closed her eyes and listened to the forest. She thought about Anna's long waiting and realized something important. Anna was never alone. The forest was her companion. The cabin was her expression. The letters were her voice. Mira felt grateful that she had been chosen to hear that voice. She knew that chance alone did not explain it. It was timing, readiness, and attention. Mira had been ready to listen when the cabin appeared in her path. That understanding filled her with quiet responsibility. She began writing more, not just notes, but reflections inspired by the cabin. She wrote about patience, about places that hold memory, and about stories that live beyond their owners. Her writing reached people far beyond the forest. Letters came back to her from readers who felt understood. Mira answered each one carefully, never claiming wisdom, only sharing experience. She often returned to the cabin after writing, as if to check whether her words still felt true in that space. They always did. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light turned golden, Mira noticed something she had never seen before. A small mark on the inside of the door, hidden by shadow. It was another carved symbol, similar to the one outside. Mira traced it with her finger and felt a deep sense of completion. She understood then that Anna had left signs not to hide, but to connect. The cabin was built to last, not just in wood, but in meaning. Mira sat on the bed and held the journal again. She read the final entry once more. Anna wrote about acceptance, about knowing that waiting does not always lead to return, but it always leads to understanding. Mira felt peace reading those words now. She no longer felt sadness for Anna. She felt respect. Over time, Myra's life outside the forest changed too. She made choices with more care. She learned to pause before rushing. She allowed silence to exist without trying to fill it. People noticed the change in her. They said she seemed grounded, present, and calm. Mira smiled when she heard this, knowing where that calm came from. It came from a cabin shaped like a wagon, hidden among trees, holding a story older than anyone expected. One day, a child visiting the cabin asked Mira a simple question. Why did the woman wait for so long? Mira thought carefully before answering. She said that waiting was not the point. Living with meaning was. The child nodded, satisfied. That moment stayed with Mira. She realized that the story had reached a place where it could teach without explanation. The cabin no longer needed her constant presence. It had become part of the forest's rhythm again. Mira began visiting less often, trusting that the space would be respected. Each time she left, she felt no loss, only gratitude. She knew that the story would continue, not through her alone, but through everyone who entered the cabin quietly and left thoughtfully. The forest stood unchanged, tall and patient. The wagon cabin remained, curved and steady, holding its place between past and present. And Mira carried forward what it had given her, not as a burden, but as a quiet guide. She understood now that some discoveries are not meant to shock or impress. They are meant to settle into the heart and stay there, shaping how a person walks through the world. The wagon cabin became a quiet landmark over the next year, not a loud attraction, not a place for noise, but a place people visited with softer voices and slower steps. Mira watched this change from a distance, careful not to let the story turn into something careless. She had learned that meaning can be damaged when people rush toward it without respect. So she worked with the forest caretakers and the local community to create simple rules. No touching the old items, no taking anything, no leaving large objects behind. Visitors could read a short guide near the entrance, and they could sit for a few minutes inside, but the cabin remained mostly as it had been. The letters and the journal were kept safe in a protected box, and copies were placed in a small town archive for learning. The original words were treated like a fragile bridge between two times. Mira wanted Anna's voice to remain clear, not worn down by careless hands. On quiet mornings, Mira still returned to the cabin alone. She would sit at the table and open her notebook, writing down thoughts that came to her in the stillness. Sometimes she wrote stories inspired by patience and faith in time. Sometimes she wrote simple lines about the forest, the smell of wood, and the way light moved across the floor. Each visit reminded her of something important. The world outside often moved too fast, but in this cabin, time moved with care. One morning in early spring, Mira arrived and sensed something different. The cabin looked the same, but the air around it felt lighter, as if the forest itself had relaxed. Inside, sunlight poured through the window in a brighter line than usual. Mira stood at the entrance for a moment, listening. She heard leaves moving softly, and far away she heard a stream. She stepped inside and sat at the table, placing her palms on the wood as she always did. Then she noticed a small envelope lying near the lantern. It had not been there before. Mira's first thought was that a visitor had left it, but the cabin rules were clear, and caretakers checked the place often. The envelope was plain, sealed, and addressed in simple writing. It said, "For the one who listens." Mira felt her throat tighten. She did not touch it right away. She waited, breathing slowly, checking her thoughts. She looked around for signs that someone had been inside recently. The dust along the floor looked undisturbed. The objects on the shelf were exactly where they should be. Even the chair's position matched how she left it. Mira lifted the envelope carefully, as if it could break. She opened it slowly and found a single folded page. The writing was not Anna's handwriting, but it was similar, neat, and gentle. Mira read the letter once, then again, making sure she understood it correctly. It was written by someone named Jonah. The letter explained that Jonah had grown up hearing about Anna as a family story that no one could confirm. Jonah's grandmother kept a small photo and a few old items and said they belonged to Anna. She also said Anna waited for a man who left and never returned. Jonah wrote that years later, after the grandmother passed away, he found a small locked chest among her belongings. Inside was a map, a few letters, and one detail that made Jonah's hands shake. There was a note that said, "If you ever find the wagon cabin, forgive me." Jonah wrote that he had looked for the cabin many times but never found it. He believed it was gone. Then he heard about a restored wagon cabin in the forest and recognized the description immediately. Jonah wrote that he visited once quietly, stayed only a few minutes, and left without disturbing anything. He said he did not want to break the peace. But he also said he could not leave without offering truth. He wrote that the man Anna waited for did not choose to disappear. The man had planned to return, but he had fallen ill on the road in a distant town. He wrote letters to Anna, but those letters never reached her. Jonah did not know exactly why. He wrote that the chest contained copies of those letters and a small pendant that the man carried, meant as a gift for Anna. Jonah placed the pendant in the town archive, so it would be safe and recorded. He also wrote that he wanted to meet Mira, not for attention, but for gratitude, because Mira had done what time failed to do. Mira had helped Anna's voice reach people. Mira finished reading and sat still, feeling as if the cabin had shifted again, not in structure but in meaning. Anna's waiting had always felt strong, even without an ending. Now, the story had an answer, not the one Anna deserved in life, but a truth that completed the shape of her experience. Mira held the letter close and felt tears rise. She did not fight them. They fell quietly, not as pain, but as release. She had carried Anna's story with care. Now she had received a final piece that belonged to it. Mira left the cabin that day with the letter safely tucked in her notebook. She walked back along the trail with a calm heart. The forest seemed brighter than before, and the air felt warmer. When she reached town, she went directly to the archive. She met the caretaker, showed the letter, and asked to see the pendant Jonah mentioned. The caretaker brought out a small wrapped item. Mira opened it carefully and saw a simple pendant, worn smooth by time. It was not expensive. It was meaningful. It looked like something made to be held close, like a promise. Mira asked the caretaker to place a photo of the pendant near the cabin guide, along with a short note. The note would explain that letters existed on both sides of the waiting, but they never met in time. It would also explain that the story was now complete, not perfect, but complete. Weeks later, Mira received a message from Jonah. They met at a small cafe, and the conversation was quiet and respectful. Jonah thanked Mira. Mira thanked Jonah. Neither of them acted like the story belonged to them. They treated it like something borrowed from the past, something that needed gentle hands. Jonah shared copies of the letters the man wrote, and Mira read them slowly. The words carried love and regret and a steady desire to return. Mira realized that Anna had been right to hope, not because hope guaranteed reunion, but because hope kept her heart open. Mira returned to the cabin one last time that season. She sat at the table and read one of Jonah's copies aloud, letting the man's words join Anna's words in the space that held them. The cabin felt peaceful, as if it had been waiting for this balance. When Mira stood to leave, she looked back at the room and felt deep gratitude. The wagon cabin had waited more than a century, not for fame, not for attention, but for understanding. Mira closed the door gently and stepped into the forest. The trees swayed softly in the wind. The path ahead was clear. And for the first time since the day she got lost, Mira did not feel lost at all.